there is a kind of treasure that ruins the men who chase it. Not because it is cursed exactly, but because of what a man must become, and what a man must owe, to hold it in his hands at last. This is the story of such a treasure. A fleece of pure gold, hanging from the branch of an oak at the far edge of the known world, in a dark grove guarded by a serpent that never slept. And it is the story of the young man who crossed the whole of the sea to take it, and gathered around him the greatest heroes who ever lived, and succeeded where every other man had failed, and of the terrible truth that lay waiting for him on the other side of his triumph. For the hardest lesson of his tale is not that some prizes are impossible to win. It is that some prizes are won only by the help of others, at a cost we never quite finish paying. His name was Jason. And to understand how a fleece of gold came to hang at the end of the world, and why a kingdom would rather send its rightful heir to die than sit beside him on a throne, we must begin, as these stories so often do, with a wrong done long ago and a prophecy that no one could escape. It began with a ram. Long before Jason was born, in the land of Boeotia, there lived two children, a boy named Phrixus and a girl named Helle, who were hated by their cruel stepmother and marked for death. But the gods took pity on them, and there appeared to them a wondrous ram, with a fleece of shining gold, sent by the messenger of heaven, who bore the children up onto its back and carried them away into the sky, flying east, away from the land that wished them dead. They flew over the sea, and the girl Helle, looking down at the dizzying water far below, lost her grip and fell and drowned in the narrow strait that men have called the Hellespont, the Sea of Helle, in memory of a child who fell from the sky. But the boy Phrixus held on, and the golden ram carried him all the way to the far eastern shore of the sea, to a distant kingdom called Colchis, at the very edge of the world where the sun rises. There he was taken in by the king, and in gratitude to the gods he sacrificed the ram that had saved him, and hung its golden fleece in a sacred grove, in the keeping of a great dragon that never closed its eyes. And so the fleece came to rest at the end of the world, a thing of legend, a treasure that everyone had heard of and no one had ever seen, waiting, though no one knew it yet, for a young man not yet born. Now turn your eyes westward again, to a kingdom called Iolcus, and to the wrong that set the whole story in motion. In Iolcus there was a rightful king named Aeson, a good man and a gentle one. But he had a half-brother, Peleus, who was neither. And Peleus hungered for the throne with the patient, gnawing hunger that eats a man from the inside. And one day Peleus took what he wanted. He seized the kingdom and cast his brother down and made himself king in Aeson's place. It is one of the oldest and saddest patterns in all these tales. The brother who cannot bear to see another wear the crown, and takes by force what was never his to take. But Peleus, for all his cruelty, was not a fool, and he was afraid. For he had gone to the oracle, as ambitious and guilty men so often do, and the oracle had given him a warning that would haunt every day of his reign. Beware, it said, the man who comes to you wearing only one sandal. From that day, Peleus watched the feet of every stranger who entered his hall. He did not know who the one-sandaled man would be or when he would come, only that when he came, he would bring the end of everything Peleus had stolen. And so the usurper sat on his brother's throne, rich and powerful and secure in every way but one, watching the door, waiting, year after year, for a single bare foot to cross his threshold. And while Peleus watched and waited, the thing he feared was quietly growing up, far away, in the care of a most unusual teacher. For Aeson, the deposed king, had a newborn son, and he knew that Peleus would murder the child rather than let a rival heir survive. So Aeson did what desperate parents in these stories do. He smuggled the baby out of the palace and sent him far from the reach of his uncle, up into the wild green slopes of Mount Pelion, into the care of Charon, the centaur. Now Chiron was no ordinary creature. He was the wisest of all the centaurs, a healer and a teacher, and to his cave on the mountainside, the greatest families of Greece sent their sons to be raised into heroes. He taught them the use of the bow and the spear, the arts of healing and of music, the movements of the stars and the ways of righteousness. And there, among the other boys who would one day become legends, the son of Aeson grew up strong and clever and good, learning everything a hero needs to know. Everything, that is, except the one thing that would have kept him safe, which was to stay hidden and content upon his mountain, and never go down to claim the throne that was his by right. But heroes are not made to stay hidden, and when the boy became a young man, Chiron gave him a name, and told him at last the truth of who he was, that he was the rightful prince of Iolcus, and that a usurper sat upon his father's throne. His name was Jason, and the day came when he took up his 2 spears, and came down from the mountain, and set his face toward the kingdom that had been stolen from his family. On the road to Iolcus, Jason came to a river in flood, its waters swollen and swift and dangerous, and on the bank there stood an old woman, frail and bent, who begged him to carry her across. Now, many a young man in a hurry to claim a kingdom would have brushed past an old woman and gone on his way. But Jason stopped. He lifted the old woman onto his back, and he waded out into the cold and treacherous water, and he carried her, step by careful step, to the other side. It was in that crossing that he lost one of his sandals, sucked off his foot, and swallowed by the river mud, so that he came up onto the far bank with 1 foot bare. And here is the thing he did not know. The old woman was not an old woman at all. She was Hera, queen of the gods herself, come down to the world in disguise to test the hearts of men. And she had a particular hatred for Peleus, who had insulted her and neglected her worship, and a particular tenderness, from that day forward, for the kind young man who had carried her across the flood without knowing who she was. So Jason walked on toward Iolcus, with the favor of the Queen of Heaven upon him, and 1 bare foot, and no idea at all that the greatest goddess in the world had just taken his side in a quarrel that would carry him to the ends of the earth. There is something worth pausing on in that small moment at the river. Jason won the help of a goddess not by strength, and not by cunning, but by simple kindness, to a stranger who could offer him nothing. Or so he believed. It is a quiet reminder, tucked into the beginning of a violent tale, that the gods and fate are often watching us most closely in the moments we think least important. And so Jason came at last to Iolcus and walked into the great hall of the king wearing one sandal. And Peleus, seeing that single bare foot, felt the cold hand of the prophecy close around his heart. Here he was, at last, the man the oracle had warned him of, standing in his own hall, and, worse, a young man who now declared himself to be the son of Aeson, the rightful heir, come to claim the throne. Peleus was afraid, but he was clever, and he did not reach for a sword. To murder the young prince openly, in front of the people, might spark a rebellion. For the old loyalty to Aeson's line still lived in the hearts of many. So Peleus smiled and welcomed his nephew and pretended to consider his claim. And then he laid a trap so perfect that Jason walked straight into it with his eyes open and his heart proud. "There is a great task," Peleus said, "a matter of honor that has hung over our family for generations. Far to the east, at the very edge of the world, in the kingdom of Colchis, hangs the golden fleece of the sacred ram, and the ghost of our kinsman Phrixus cannot rest until it is brought home to Greece. Bring me the golden fleece," said Peleus, "and I will gladly give you the throne." It was, of course, a death sentence, dressed as an honor. No one had ever brought back the golden fleece. No one who sailed for Colchis ever came home at all. Peleus was certain. He was sending the young man to his death, and ridding himself of the prophecy forever, and looking generous while he did it. And Jason, young, proud, hungry to prove himself, and certain in the way that only the young and untested can be certain, accepted. He would build a ship, he declared, and gather the finest heroes in all of Greece. And he would sail to the end of the world and bring back the fleece, and claim his father's throne. And watching from Olympus, the goddess Hera smiled. For this was exactly the quest she had been waiting to set in motion. The ship he built was called the Argo, and it was like no vessel that had ever sailed. It was made with the help of the goddess Athena herself, built of pine from Mount Pelion, larger and stronger and swifter than any ship before it. And into its prow Athena set a beam cut from the sacred-speaking oak of Dodona, a piece of wood that could talk and prophesy and warn the crew of what lay ahead. And when the ship was ready, the call went out across all of Greece that Jason was gathering a crew for the greatest voyage ever attempted, and that heroes were wanted. And they came. Oh, they came. From every corner of the land they came, the mightiest men of that whole golden age of heroes, drawn by the promise of glory and the lure of the impossible. They would be called the Argonauts, the sailors of the Argo, and their roll of names is like a summary of everything Greek legend had to offer. Mighty Heracles came, the strongest man in the world, in the midst of his own great labors. Orpheus came, the greatest musician who ever lived, whose songs could soothe wild beasts and move stones to tears. The twin brothers Castor and Polydeuces came, one a master of horses, and the other the finest boxer alive. Keen-eyed Lynceus came, who could see through the earth itself. The winged sons of the north wind, Zates and Calais, came, who could fly. Atalanta the huntress came, the swiftest woman alive. Typhus came, the helmsman, who could read the sea and the stars. And many more besides, each one a legend in his own right. each one, leaving behind his own story to become, for a while, part of a greater one. Picture the strangeness and the wonder of it. The greatest heroes of an entire age. Men who, in any other tale, would each be the center of everything, all crowded together onto a single ship, bending to a single set of oars, bound to a single impossible purpose. And at their head, untested and young, stood Jason, whose true gift, it would turn out, was not that he was the strongest or the wisest of them, but that he was the one who could hold them all together. They launched the Argo into the water, and Orpheus struck up a song to set the rhythm of the oars, and the greatest voyage in the world began. And almost at once they learned that the sea would test not only their strength, but their hearts. Their first landfall was the island of Lemnos, and it hid a dark secret. For the women of Lemnos had, some time before, risen up and killed all the men of the island in a single terrible night, every husband, every father, every son. And now they lived alone, a whole island of women, without men. And when the Argo appeared on their horizon, they came down to the shore. But they did not come to fight. They welcomed the heroes warmly and feasted them. And the Argonauts, weary from the sea, found the welcome sweet and lingered. Days became weeks. The heroes settled into the comfort of the island, into soft beds and warm arms, and the forgetting of all their purpose. And the golden fleece and the great quest began to seem very far away, and not very urgent at all. It was Heracles, of all of them, who finally broke the spell. Heracles, who had stayed with the ship, and who came storming up to shame his comrades, reminding them, roughly, that they had not sailed from Greece to grow fat and idle on an island of women, but to win eternal glory. And the heroes, shamed, tore themselves away, and returned to the Argo, and put back out to sea. It is a pattern you may recognize if you know the older tales of the sea. The danger, again, is not always a monster with teeth. Sometimes the deadliest thing a wandering hero faces is simply comfort, the soft temptation to stop, to rest, to forget the hard road ahead, and settle for the easy pleasure of the moment. The Argonauts nearly lost their whole quest, not to a storm or a sea beast, but to a warm welcome. And it would not be the last time. The voyage carried them on, into stranger and darker waters. They came to the land of the Doliones, and their young king Cyzicus welcomed them with real kindness, and feasted them, and sent them on their way with blessings. But that night, blown back by a contrary wind, in the pitch dark, the Argonauts landed again on the very same shore without knowing it. And the Doliones, in the blackness, did not recognize the returning ship, and took the heroes for raiders come to attack them. And so, in the confusion and terror of a night battle, friend fell upon friend. And by the time the dawn came up and showed them what they had done, the young king Cyzicus lay dead by his own hand, killed by the very guest he had welcomed only hours before. There was no enemy in that fight. There was only darkness and fear and a terrible mistake, and grief on both sides when the light finally came. The Argonauts wept, and the widowed queen of the Doliones died of her sorrow, and the heroes stayed to bury the dead and mourn before they could bring themselves to sail on. It is one of the bleakest moments of the voyage, and it lands so hard, precisely because there is no one to blame and no one to fight. Only the ordinary, unbearable tragedy of good men killing good men in the dark, believing they were defending themselves. The sea, it seemed, could wound the heart in ways that had nothing to do with monsters at all. And then, not long after, the voyage lost its greatest hero. They put in to shore to cut new oars, and Heracles went into the woods, and with him went his beloved young companion, Hylas, sent to fetch water from a spring. But when Hylas knelt at the pool, the water nymphs who lived there saw the beautiful youth, and fell in love with him, and drew him down beneath the surface. And he vanished without a trace. Heracles, when he found the boy gone, went half mad with grief, and roamed the forest, calling and calling his name, and would not leave, and would not stop searching. And the Argo, catching a fair wind in the night, sailed on without him. Some say by accident, some say because the sea god willed it, some say because a voyage cannot belong to the strongest man in the world, or it becomes his story, and not everyone's. And so Heracles, the mightiest of them all, was left behind, still searching the woods for a lost boy, and passed out of the tale of the Argonauts and back into his own. There is something quietly meaningful in that parting, if you sit with it. The greatest hero on the ship, the one everyone assumed would be the one to win the Fleece. And the story simply moves on without him, because his strength was never going to be the thing that mattered most in the end. What lay ahead could not be solved by the strongest arms in the world. It would take other kinds of power altogether. And in the long days between the islands, out on the open water, where there was nothing to fight and nothing to do but row and wait and watch, the horizon, the true character of the voyage revealed itself. For a ship is a small world, and a crew of proud heroes, each accustomed to being the greatest man in any room he entered, might easily have torn itself apart with rivalries and quarrels over who should lead and who should have the glory. And there were quarrels, and there was pride, and there were long simmering tempers under the hot sun. But every evening when the rowing was done, and the Argo rode quiet at anchor beneath the stars, Orpheus would take up his lyre, and he would play, and the music of the greatest singer who ever lived would drift out over the dark water, and the hard men who had killed and would kill again would fall silent, and listen, and remember why they had come, not for gold in the end, but for the thing that no single one of them could win alone, and that all of them together might just be able to reach. It was Orpheus's music, as much as Jason's leadership or Tiphys's steering, that held the fellowship of the Argo together through all the long months of the sea. And there is something worth remembering in that too. We think of a great voyage as a thing of storms survived and monsters slain, of the loud and dramatic moments that fill the songs. But most of any journey is the quiet part, the ordinary days, the waiting, the small kindnesses, and the shared silences that keep a company of weary travelers from coming apart before they ever reach the thing they set out to find. The heroes remembered the clashing rocks all their lives, but it was the music in the evenings, and the bread shared at the oars, and the 1,000 unremarkable nights of simply enduring together that truly carried them to the edge of the world. And of all the crew, it was gentle Orpheus, who never struck a blow whose gift may have mattered most of all. They sailed on, and they met tests that each of the heroes was uniquely made to meet. They came to the land of a brutal king named Amycus, a son of the sea god, who forced every stranger who landed on his shores to face him in a boxing match to the death, and who had never lost. But among the Argonauts was Polydeuces, the finest boxer in the world, and he stepped forward and took up the challenge. And though Amycus was huge and savage, Polydeuces was faster and cleverer, and in the end he struck the tyrant down and freed that coast from its cruel toll. And then they came to a place that would change the course of the whole voyage, the home of a blind old man named Phineus, who was suffering under one of the strangest and most miserable curses in all the tales. Phineus had once been a great prophet gifted by Apollo with the power to see the future. But he had misused the gift, or revealed too much of what the gods wished hidden, and for this he had been terribly punished. He was struck blind, and worse, far worse. Every time food was set before him, down from the sky would swoop the Harpies, foul-winged creatures, part bird and part woman, who would snatch the food from his very hands and befoul what they could not carry off, so that the old prophet could never eat a proper meal and was slowly starving to death in the midst of plenty, tormented and filthy and alone. When the Argonauts came to him, the old man begged them for help, for he had seen in his prophecy that among their number were the very heroes who could free him. And those heroes were Zates and Calais, the winged sons of the north wind. When next the Harpies swooped down to steal the old man's food, the two winged brothers rose into the air after them, swords drawn, and chased them across the sky, faster and faster, until at last the gods sent word that the Harpies were to be spared, but were to torment Phineus no more. And the old prophet, able to eat at last, wept with gratitude, and in return he gave the Argonauts the most precious gift he had, knowledge. He told them what lay ahead on their road to Colchis, and he warned them of the single most terrible obstacle in all the sea, the gate they would have to pass to reach the eastern waters at all. He told them of the clashing rocks. The clashing rocks, the Symplegades, were two vast cliffs of stone that stood on either side of a narrow strait, and they were not fixed and still like ordinary rocks. They moved. They floated on the sea, and when anything tried to pass between them, they rushed together with a speed and a force that would crush it to splinters in an instant, and then drifted apart again to wait for the next victim. No ship had ever passed the clashing rocks and survived. But Phineus had told them the secret. When you come to the rocks, he said, do not try to row through on courage alone. First, release a dove and let it fly ahead of you between the cliffs. Watch what the rocks do to the dove, and watch what happens after. And so, when the Argo came at last to that dreadful strait, and the heroes saw the two great cliffs grinding and booming against each other and falling apart again, Jason did as the old prophet had said. He loosed a dove, and it darted forward into the gap, and the rocks slammed together after it with a crash like the end of the world. But the dove was swift, and it came through on the far side with only the tips of its tail feathers clipped away. And in the heartbite that followed, as the rocks recoiled and began to drift apart once more. Typhus, the helmsman, gave the command, and every hero bent to his oar with all the strength that was in him, and Orpheus's voice drove the rhythm, and the Argo shot forward into the gap. The rocks began to close. The heroes rowed as men row only once in their lives, when their lives depend on it. And the goddess Athena herself, watching over them, reached down with an unseen hand and held the rocks apart for one heartbeat longer, and gave the ship one final push. And the Argo burst through to the far side, just as the cliffs crashed together behind it, catching and shearing away the very tip of the ship's stern. But no more. They were through. They had done what no ship had ever done, and it is said that the clashing rocks, cheated of their prey at last, were fixed forever in place from that day on, and never moved again, so that the Argo was the first ship to pass them, and the reason no ship would ever have to fear them again. Notice, if you will, how they passed. Not by strength, though they rowed with all their might, not by courage alone, though they had courage to spare. They passed because an old blind man had given them knowledge, and because a goddess lent them her hand, and because they were willing to be warned and to be helped. Again and again, this is the quiet truth, threading through the whole voyage. The greatest dangers in the world are not overcome by heroes alone, but by heroes who accept the help that is offered to them. And so, at last, having crossed the whole of the sea and passed the gate that no ship had ever passed, the Argonauts came to Colchis, to the kingdom at the edge of the world, where the golden fleece hung waiting in its sacred grove. But their trials were not ending. In truth, the hardest part of the whole quest was only now beginning. For the king of Colchis was Aeetes, a son of the sun god himself, a proud and formidable and dangerous man, and he had no intention whatsoever of simply handing over the greatest treasure in his kingdom to a band of foreign strangers. Jason came before him and asked, courteously, for the fleece, offering his service and his friendship in return. And Aeetes, hiding his fury behind a cold smile, set him a price he was certain no mortal man could ever pay. "If you truly wish to have the golden fleece," said the king, "then you must first prove yourself worthy of it by performing a single day's work. In my fields there graze 2 great bulls, gifts of the god of fire, with hooves of bronze and breath of living flame. You must yoke these bulls to a plow, a thing I alone have ever done, and with them you must plow a great field. And then into the furrows you must sow these teeth of a dragon. And from those teeth," said the king, watching Jason's face, "there will spring up out of the earth an army of armed warriors, full-grown and hungry for battle. And you must fight them and defeat them, every one, before the sun goes down. Do this, and the fleece is yours." It was, of course, meant to be impossible. The bulls alone would burn a man to ash before he ever got near them. And even if, by some miracle, he survived the bulls and the plowing, an army born from the earth would surely cut him down. Aeetes set the task certain that he was watching a dead man make his bow, and Jason, for all his courage, looked at the fire-breathing bulls and the teeth of the dragon, and knew in his heart that he could not do this. Not by strength, not by cunning, not by any power that he or any of his heroes possessed. The quest, it seemed, had come to the end of what heroism could achieve. And that is exactly the moment when the true architect of the whole tale stepped quietly out of the shadows. Her name was Medea. She was the daughter of King Aetes himself, a princess of Colchis, and she was something far more dangerous and far more powerful than a princess. She was a priestess of Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, and she was a sorceress of terrible skill, versed in every dark art, in poisons and potions and spells that could turn back rivers and pull the moon from the sky. And the goddesses, Hera and Aphrodite, watching from above and determined that Jason should succeed, had done a quiet and fateful thing. They had caused Medea to fall hopelessly in love with the young foreign hero the moment she first saw him. And so Medea found herself caught in an agony that would define and destroy the rest of her life. On the one side stood her father, her home, her family, her whole world. On the other stood a stranger, a foreigner, who would sail away and leave her forever the moment he had what he came for, and yet whom she loved with a fierce and consuming passion she could not control and had never asked for. She knew even then, some part of her must have known, that to help him was to betray everything she was and to gamble her entire life on the faithfulness of a man she barely knew. And she chose to help him anyway. In the dead of night, she came to Jason in secret, this princess witch with the power to save him, and she made him a promise, and she asked for one in return. She would give him the means to survive her father's impossible tasks, and in exchange he would swear a sacred oath to take her away with him to Greece, and to make her his wife, and to be true to her forever. And Jason, who needed her, who could not succeed without her, who, in that desperate moment, perhaps even believed the words as he said them, swore the oath. He swore by all the gods to be faithful to Medea forever. Hold on to that oath. Remember it, because everything that is beautiful and everything that is terrible in the rest of this story flows from that single promise made in the dark by a man who needed a woman's help to win his glory. Medea gave Jason a magic ointment made from a flower that had sprung from the blood of tortured Prometheus, and she told him to anoint his body and his shield and his spear with it, and that, for a single day, it would make him invulnerable to fire and to iron alike. And she told him the secret of the earth-born army, too, that when the warriors sprang up from the sown dragon's teeth, he should throw a great stone into their midst, and that they, not knowing where it came from, would turn upon one another in confusion and destroy themselves. And so, when the dreadful day came, and all of Colchis gathered to watch the foreign prince die, Jason walked out into the field, gleaming with Medea's ointment, and the fire-breathing bulls charged him, and their flames washed over him, and did not burn him. And he seized them by their bronze horns, and wrestled them down, and forced the yoke upon their necks. And he plowed the field with bulls of fire, as no man but a god's own son had ever done, while the king watched in mounting disbelief. And he sowed the dragon's teeth, and up from the furrows rose the terrible harvest, an army of armed men, clawing their way out of the soil. full-grown and armored, and turning their eyes upon him. And Jason, remembering Medea's words, took up a great boulder and hurled it into the midst of them. And the earth-born warriors, each accusing the other, fell into a furious battle among themselves, and cut one another down in the dust from which they had just been born, until the field was still again, and the task was done. Aeetes watched it all with a cold and growing rage, for he understood at once what had happened. No stranger could have survived that day by his own power. The stranger had been helped, and there was only one person in his kingdom with the knowledge and the power to have helped him, his own daughter. The king said nothing, and smiled his cold smile, and told Jason to return the next day for his prize. But in his heart, he had already resolved that the foreigners would never leave Colchis alive, and that he would have the fleece back, and his treacherous daughter punished before the sun rose twice more. But Medea knew her father. She knew that look, and she knew that Aeetes had no intention of ever surrendering the fleece, and that he meant to murder Jason and all his men in the night. And so she made her final, irreversible choice. She fled from her father's palace in the darkness, and came to the Argonauts, and told them the truth, that they were all to die at dawn, and that their only hope was to seize the fleece that very night and flee. And she told them, too, that she alone could get them past the last and greatest guardian. For the golden fleece hung in a grove sacred to the god of war, and it was guarded by a dragon, an enormous serpent, coiled around the base of the oak, that never slept, whose unblinking eyes had watched over the treasure for generations, and which no warrior could ever hope to fight past. Medea led Jason through the dark to that grove, and there the great dragon reared up hissing to meet them, its endless coils shifting in the gloom. And Medea did not draw a weapon. She began softly to sing. She sang an enchantment, a lullaby of terrible power, and she sprinkled upon the creature's eyes drops of a potion brewed for this one purpose. And slowly, slowly for the first time, in all its long watch, the sleepless dragon's eyes began to close. Its great head sank to the earth. Its coils loosened and grew still, and the guardian that had never slept, slept at last, lulled into unconsciousness by the witch's song. And Jason climbed past the sleeping serpent, and lifted the golden fleece down from the oak, and it shone in the darkness like a piece of the fallen sun, so bright that he could scarcely bear to look at it. He had it. After everything, the sea, the rocks, the bulls, the earth-born army, he held the golden fleece in his arms at last. But look closely, if you will, at how he came to hold it. He did not defeat the dragon. Medea put it to sleep. He did not survive the bulls by his own strength. Medea's ointment saved him. At every one of the last and hardest steps, it wasn't Jason the hero who won the golden fleece. It was Medea the sorceress who won it for him, and handed it to him, and asked for nothing in return but the promise he had already sworn. The whole glory of the great quest, the triumph that would make Jason's name immortal. It belonged, in truth, at least as much to the foreign princess who had betrayed her father and her home for the love of a man who would not, in the end, keep faith with her. That is the debt at the dark heart of this story. And it would come do. They fled that same night, the Fleece aboard the Argo, and Medea aboard with it, and behind them the whole fury of Colchis awoke and gave chase. King Aeetes launched his fleet in pursuit, and at its head sailed Medea's own brother, Apsyrtus, hunting his traitor sister across the sea. And here the tale grows very dark, and we must not look away from it, for it is the shadow that falls across the whole rest of Jason's life. To escape her brother's pursuit, Medea did a terrible thing. By some tellings, she lured her brother into a trap, and Jason struck him down. By others, she did the deed herself. But however it happened, Medea's own brother died, so that Jason's ship could escape. Cut down, and, in the oldest and grimmest versions, cut apart. His pieces scattered upon the water, so that his grieving father would have to stop and gather them for burial, and so lose the chase. It is a horror, and it is meant to be. The woman who had already given up her home and her father for Jason now gave up her brother's very life, and stained her own soul beyond all cleansing, all for the sake of a hero who had sworn to love her. And Jason let her do it. He took the benefit of that terrible crime, as he had taken the benefit of all her others, and sailed on toward his glory with the fleece in his hold and a murdered man in his wake. Whatever glory was waiting for Jason in Greece, it had been bought now with blood that could never be washed away, and not his blood, but hers. This is the thing the tale will not let us forget, however far the Argo sails, that the golden triumph and the golden fleece were paid for, in the end, by Medea, and that the price she paid was her own goodness. The voyage home was long and strange and haunted, as if the sea itself knew what had been done. The gods sent storms against them for the killing of Apsyrtus, and the speaking beam of the Argo cried out that they were polluted with murder, and could not go home until they were cleansed of it. And so they were forced to sail to the island of the enchantress Circe, who was Medea's own aunt, and there Circe performed the dark rites that purified them of the blood guilt. Though even she, when she understood what her niece had done, was horrified, and would not offer her the full welcome of kin. Purified, but not forgiven, the Argonauts sailed on, and passed through dangers that the older wanderers of the sea would one day face as well. They came to the island of the Sirens, whose deadly song lured sailors to their deaths upon the rocks. But the Argonauts carried with them the one man in the world who could answer that song. For Orpheus took up his lyre and played a music so much sweeter and more beautiful than the Sirens' own, that the heroes rowed safely past, hearing only the song of their friend. They passed, too, near the twin horrors of Scylla and Charybdis, the monster and the whirlpool, and came through by the help of the gods. And at last, nearing home, they came to the island of Crete, which was guarded by Talos, a giant made all of bronze, an enormous automaton who circled the island 3 times a day and hurled great boulders at any ship that dared approach. No weapon could pierce his bronze body. But Talos had one flaw, a single vein, running from his neck to his ankle, sealed by a single bronze nail, and within that vein ran the strange divine fluid that was his life. And Medea, once again, was the one who saw the way. By her magic and her cunning she caused the great bronze giant to graze his ankle, and to loosen the nail, so that the fluid of his life ran out of him like molten lead, and the towering guardian of Crete crashed down, lifeless, upon the shore. Once more, it was Medea who cleared the final obstacle. Once more, the heroes owed their survival to the foreign witch, and once more they sailed on, toward the home she would never truly be allowed to share. At last, after all of it, the Argo came home to Iolcus, and Jason stepped ashore with the golden fleece in his hands. The treasure that no man had ever won, brought back at the end of the world's greatest voyage. He had done it. He had fulfilled the impossible task that Peleus had set him certain he would die attempting. And now surely was the moment of triumph, the moment when the usurper would keep his word and yield up the stolen throne, and the wronged prince would take his rightful place, and the story would find its happy ending. But that is not what happened. For Peleus had never dreamed that Jason would return, and he had not spent the years of the voyage idle. In some tellings he had, in Jason's absence, driven the young man's family to their deaths, believing the son already lost at sea. And he had no more intention of surrendering the throne now than he had ever had. The fleece was won, the impossible was achieved, and still the usurper sat on the stolen throne and would not come down. And so the great and glorious quest, the voyage that had cost so many lives and so much blood, delivered Jason home to exactly the injustice he had left behind. A wrong that all his heroism had not, in the end, been able to set right. It is a bitter thing to sit with. Jason crossed the whole world and back, and won a treasure out of legend, and it did not buy him the one thing he had truly sailed for, which was his father's throne, and simple justice. And, once again, it would not be Jason who found the way through. It would be Medea. What Medea did next was the most terrible of all her deeds, and the one that would finally turn the world against her. She went to the daughters of Peleus, the old king's own loving children, and she showed them a wonder. She took an old ram, worn out with age, and she cut it into pieces, and boiled it in a cauldron with her magic herbs. And out of the cauldron leapt a young lamb, alive and new. She had the power, she told the daughters of Peleus, to give the same gift to their aged father, to cut away his old age, and boil away his years, and give him back his youth. If only they loved him enough to help. And the daughters who did love their father, and who longed to see him young and strong again, believed her. In the night, with their own hands, they struck down their sleeping father, and cut him to pieces, and cast him into the cauldron. And this time Medea withheld her magic herbs, and there was no lamb, and no youth, and no waking. There was only an old man murdered by the daughters, who adored him, tricked into the most horrifying act imaginable by a sorceress, who used their love against them. And so Peleus, the usurper, died at last, as he perhaps deserved to die, but by a means so monstrous that even Jason could not profit from it. The people of Iolcus, horrified, drove Jason and Medea out of the kingdom altogether. The throne, won by such an atrocity, could not be held. Jason had his revenge on the man who had wronged his family, and it gained him nothing but exile. Notice, one last time, the shape of it. Jason wanted the throne, and Medea got it for him, by a deed so dark that having it became impossible. Everything she touched for his sake turned to both triumph and ruin in the same moment. She could win him anything. She could not make the winning clean. And so we come to the end, and to the question. The whole tale has been circling from the very start. What became of the hero who won the golden fleece? For a time, Jason and Medea lived in exile together in the city of Corinth, and she bore him children. And for a while, perhaps, there was something like a life. But the promise Jason had sworn in the dark grove of Colchis, the oath of faithfulness that had bought him everything, that promise, in the end, he broke, when the chance came to marry the young daughter of the king of Corinth, and to win a throne and a future for himself. At last, Jason took it. He set Medea aside, the woman who had betrayed her father and killed her brother, and murdered a king, and crossed the whole world for his sake. And he prepared to wed another, and told himself, no doubt, that it was the wise and sensible thing to do. He had forgotten his debt. He had forgotten that everything he was, everything he had, every scrap of his glory, had been given to him by the woman he was now casting aside. But Medea did not forget. Medea never forgot anything. And the revenge she took upon him was so complete and so terrible that it has echoed through 3,000 years. For in her fury and her heartbreak she destroyed everything Jason loved and hoped for, his new bride, and, most dreadfully of all, in the darkest version of the tale, their own children, so that Jason was left with nothing at all. No wife, no sons, no throne, no future. The man who had crossed the world and won the golden fleece ended his life alone and broken. All his glory turned to ash in his hands. And his death, when it came, was a quiet and fitting one. Old now, and forgotten, and long past the days of his fame, Jason came one day to the shore where the Argo, the great ship of his youth, lay rotting on the sand, hauled up and abandoned, and slowly falling to pieces, a monument to a glory that no longer meant anything. And as he sat beneath it, lost in memory of all that he had been and all that he had lost, a beam of the rotten old ship, some say the very speaking beam of Dodona that had guided him so long ago, broke loose and fell, and struck him, and killed him. The hero who won the golden fleece was killed by the wreck of the ship that won it. There is no crueler and no more honest ending in all the tales. So let us return at the last to the treasure we began with, and to the truth it was hiding all along. The golden fleece was real, and Jason won it, and his name lives forever because of it. But the tale of the Argonauts is not, in the end, a story about a prize. It is a story about a debt, about all the hands that lifted Jason toward his glory, and the one hand he refused, at the last, to hold. A goddess carried across a river set him on his road. The greatest heroes in the world bent to the oars of his ship. A blind prophet gave him the knowledge to pass the clashing rocks. And above all, a foreign princess gave up her home, her family, her brother, her innocence, and her very soul, to place the fleece into his arms, and asked for nothing but faithfulness, and did not even receive that. Jason's tragedy was never that his quest was too hard. His quest, in truth, was won for him, again and again, by others. His tragedy was that he took all of it, all that help, and all that love, and all that sacrifice, and He never understood that he owed anything for it, until the debt came back to collect everything he had. And there is a quiet warning in that, reaching across all the centuries between his world and ours. We are none of us as self-made as we like to believe. Whatever we win, whatever we build, whatever glory we gather to ourselves, we win it and build it, and gather it on the strength of 100 hands that helped us, and 100 kindnesses we did not earn, the ones who carried us across our rivers, who lent us their strength at the oars, who gave us the knowledge to pass through the rocks that would have crushed us. And the whole of a life, perhaps, comes down to whether we remember that debt and honor it, or whether, like Jason, we take the golden fleece and sail away, and forget the one who put it in our hands. Rest now. Let the sound of the oars, and the sea, and the long, slow breath of the tide carry you gently down. And remember, as you drift, all the unseen hands that have ever carried you, and be in your own life a little kinder to them than the hero of this tale ever was.